In trying to assemble a policy, foreign policy, for the United States to follow in dealing with Indochina, with Vietnam and Cambodia in 1990 forward, there were two central structures that we at the State Department would be involved in, that I, as Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for Southeast Asia, would be playing a significant role in. One was trying to find a peace agreement for Cambodia. No one, very few people, almost no one thought it was possible to do something like this. But Assistant Secretary Solomon, a few others said, we've got to give it a shot. And so there was established within the United Nations a negotiating structure made up of the permanent 5 members of the UN Security Council. That is the US, China, the Soviet Union, Britain, and France, known as the PERM 5. And there were representatives from the foreign ministries in Paris and in London, from China and the Soviet Union, and from the State Department, from our East Asia and Pacific Bureau. And the PERM 5 group would be meeting and working on an agreement that they could sign, and the parties involved in settling Cambodia could also sign. So Vietnam and Australia and India, that were countries very interested in Southeast Asia. So China, countries of Southeast Asia, all would be available to sign this agreement if one could be negotiated. And it had to be negotiated with all of the parties inside Cambodia. So to add to the complexities of the international setting, inside Cambodia, you have, first of all, the Khmer Rouge, the terrible Pol Pot-led radical group who still had influence and who still were in the chair, the Cambodia chair in the UN General Assembly, representing Cambodia. You had King Sihanouk, who had been out of power for 20 years, but very anxious to be restored to the throne in Cambodia. Then you had royalists led by a man named Prince Norodom Ranariddh, the son of King Sihanouk, who had a military force and a political force that was known by its French acronym FUNSENPEC. And within FUNSENPEC, there were other subgroups, including one in particular led by an activist named Sam Rainsy. And somehow we would have to come up with ways of pulling all of these Cambodian groups together. And then there were non-royalist Democrats as well. And each of these groups had some fighting force inside Cambodia with which to deal. So that's the one hand, how do you solve Cambodia? On the other hand, there is the US government's channel relationship to negotiate with the Vietnamese government in Hanoi. And this would be done by a group that would be made up of representatives of different agencies in the US government. So I was the chair of what was called the Interagency Working Group on POW MIAs, the IAG, Interagency Group for the shorthand. And there were big differences between the representative of the Defense Department. There was also a representative of the National League of POW MIA families that served in this group. And we would meet, and then you had the various parts of the military itself that were the ones conducting investigations to determine the fate of our missing men. So this inside the US government is also another group that we had to deal with. I was the chair of that. And there was a wonderful, incredible, a great American hero named General Jack Vessey, who from Minnesota, a man who had been a non-commissioned officer in World War II, had a battlefield commission in Anzio, and went on to become a 4-star general, and who was leading the U.S. military, who was chairman of the Joint Chiefs, now retired. He had been asked to come back and be the president's special representative on POW MIA accounting. And so I had to deal with all of these people. Great thrill and honor to deal with General Vessey, but there were terrible differences inside the U.S. government about how we would negotiate with North Vietnam, negotiate with Hanoi, and in this, I would once again have to find a way. How do we find openings in all of this to have our policy move forward? It seemed like mission impossible when I arrived back in Washington, D.C., and I had to wonder, are we really going to be able to make anything out of this? So many different avenues, so many different roads to be followed. It was, as I said, it seemed like almost hopeless situation, but given our interests, given that commitment I felt, particularly to those still unaccounted for 2,500 POW MIAs, the bond that came from combat in Vietnam, I felt I had to give it my best shot.